In this podcast episode, Dr. David Starkey shares a profound critique of the current state of British politics, focusing on the right-wing factions, the structural failures of the British state, and the challenges facing governance, law, and national identity. He analyzes the fragmentation on the political right, the legacy of New Labour's legislative reforms, the debilitating role of the judiciary and experts, and the potential for national crisis. Starkey draws parallels between current events and historical moments, offering perspectives on what might be required to restore stability and coherence to the system. Dr. Starkey begins by outlining the fractious state of right-wing politics in Britain, highlighting the divisions among the Conservative Party, Reform UK, and Restore. Despite shared policy goals, these groups are embroiled in damaging personal hostilities and mutual suspicion, which undermine the possibility of a united front. The competition in events like the Makersfield by-election serves as an example of this internecine warfare. Notwithstanding the bitterness, Starkey stresses that beneath rhetorical differences, there is growing agreement on fundamental policy issues, particularly the recognition that the British state's machinery is failing. Starkey identifies a systemic malfunction at the heart of British governance, describing it as an autoimmune disease, where the state's institutions are effectively consuming themselves from within. He attributes this to changes initiated under New Labour, which replaced a political constitution with a legal constitution, imbuing courts and unelected experts with unprecedented power. This shift has resulted in paralysis and stasis, as elected officials are blocked by judicial interventions, Quangos, and a legal framework that subverts democratic accountability. Starkey argues this fundamental breakdown is at the core of many separate problems, such as financial instability, immigration, and education. A significant portion of the discussion focuses on the impact of New Labour's legislation, particularly the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act, which Starkey contends have introduced alien legal principles that disrupt the practical governance of society. He criticizes provisions that remove budgetary control from elected representatives, place strict judicial scrutiny over asylum and social policies, and impose unrealistic legal standards that undermine efficient public administration. Starkey highlights examples such as judicial interference in immigration enforcement, costly environmental regulations, and the Special Educational Needs Tribunal system to demonstrate how legal overreach debilitates the state's capacity to function effectively. Starkey is deeply critical of political leadership across recent decades, citing the rapid turnover of prime ministers as symptomatic of the broader systemic failure. He points to inadequacy, poor judgment, and entanglement with the flawed legal and bureaucratic system as reasons why even well-intentioned leaders have failed. The political class, Starkey claims, has not confronted the scale of the crisis and often perpetuates failed policies, with figures like David Cameron, George Osborne, Boris Johnson, and Theresa May inheriting and exacerbating the problems. He particularly condemns May for enabling the rise of non-crime hate incidents and for implementing net zero legislation that further cedes authority to unelected bodies. In Starkey's view, the political left remains oblivious to the systemic collapse, locked into an ideological embrace of Keynesian fiscal policies and magic thinking, akin to belief in miracles. He dismisses the current Labour leadership as incapable of recognizing or addressing the crisis, describing their approach as a rehash of failed economic models unable to sustain borrowing-driven public spending without triggering inflation or economic ruin. Starkey argues that this delusion on the left ensures the continuation of public sector decline and fiscal irresponsibility while ignoring the structural reforms needed to revive the British state. Starkey critiques the proliferation of quasi-independent agencies and experts who wield vast influence over public policy without democratic oversight. Drawing historical comparisons to Churchill and Theodore Roosevelt's famous axiom, "Scientists on tap, not on top," he laments how the current system elevates experts and unelected officials above politicians. This delegation of authority results in irrational policy decisions driven by narrow single-issue interests rather than coherent national strategy, illustrated by excessive environmental costs and inefficiencies in infrastructure projects like HS2 and nuclear power. a recurring theme is the loss of the state's core duties of defending its borders and protecting its citizens. Starkey portrays the current government, under Starmer, as hostile to British identity, culture, and sovereignty, citing concessions to IRA-linked groups and policies favoring immigrants over native populations as evidence. He highlights the demoralization of the armed forces and the erosion of patriotic and historical education as symptoms of this malaise. The failure to maintain effective border control and to properly support the military signals a dangerous vulnerability in national security. Throughout the conversation, Starkey draws parallels between the present crisis and crucial turning points in British history, such as the reigns of Charles I and James II, the constitutional struggles of the 17th century, and the political realignments of the 1970s. He warns that without fundamental constitutional reform or a form of great repeal to undo new labor's legal changes, the country risks disintegration. Starkey stresses the importance of reconnecting contemporary governance with Britain's historical experience and traditions to restore effective political authority and social cohesion. The podcast discusses how personality clashes, personal grudges, and factional rancor on the right impede necessary alliances. Leaders feel genuine mutual distrust and skepticism about each other's motives and seriousness, which complicates potential coalitions or agreements. Starkey also criticizes the populist trope of ordinary people candidates, arguing that inexperienced politicians are unlikely to succeed against the entrenched legal bureaucratic system. He insists that strong, articulate leadership, figures with vision comparable to Thatcher or Churchill, is needed to navigate the systemic crisis. Starkey is starkly pessimistic about the country's trajectory, stating for the first time that survival is not guaranteed and that the current crisis rivals those of the world wars in its gravity. He foresees economic bankruptcy, possible IMF intervention, and socio-political disintegration if current policies remain unchallenged. Starkey warns of the dangers posed by ideological blindness on both sides of the political spectrum, the erosion of state authority, and increasing social division, which might lead to violence or low-level civil conflict if no unifying leadership arises. The rise of parties like Restore and Reform reflects a dissatisfaction with the established Conservative Party and a desire for radical change. Starkey acknowledges the revolutionary rhetoric and symbolism employed by these groups, but regards their actual policy positions as not substantially divergent from traditional conservative reform. He identifies a generational and stylistic gap between these groups and stresses the importance of transforming rhetorical protest into coherent political strategy capable of securing parliamentary majorities and implementing change. Starkey critiques the left's magic thinking and ideological zealotry, especially regarding issues like gender identity and human rights, which he views as distortions of biological and legal realities. He observes how language on the left is often used manipulatively, divorcing words from traditional meaning to enforce political agendas. This phenomenon, he argues, contributes to societal confusion and undermines common understandings necessary for collective governance and social stability. The episode closes with reflections on the absence of a leader capable of articulating the crisis and leading a restoration. Starkey expresses a hope, though expressed with some skepticism, that someone might emerge to guide the country through constitutional reform and national revival. He dismisses figures like Theresa May as incapable and calls for a leader with the clarity, vision, and capacity to unite the right and counter the systemic failures engulfing Britain.